Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker is coming out later this week in just a couple of days. The final installment in the final trilogy in the Skywalker saga. And I will definitely watch the film. I'll definitely review it on the channel. But I thought I'd go ahead and make this video to give a bit of a heads up and a bit of a background on how I will approach the film, why I will approach it this way, and why I have certain feelings on the series and on the upcoming film. What are my reasons for having them? So I'm a big fan of Star Wars, always have been. I grew up with the series. I watched them for the first time when I was, I think, 4 years old. I wanted to be Luke Skywalker when I grew up. Played with the toys, read some of the books, played video games. I was really always engaged in the fandom. I was always part of the Star Wars fandom. And so, as a result, it may seem weird when I say that I am utterly unexcited for the upcoming movie. I'm just not feeling any sort of hype whatsoever, which is weird because, as I said, it's the conclusion, right? It's the last chapter in the Skywalker saga, so I should be just about as excited as I was last year for what was it, this year? It was this year for Avengers Endgame, which, I rewatched the trailer over and over again, and I couldn't wait for the film to come out. But with this one, I'm just not very excited at all, and I wanted to go back, take a look at the Star Wars history of the Skywalker movies, and try and find out and explain myself why that is. So, to begin, we have to go all the way back to 1977, which is when the original Star Wars came out and immediately became a smash hit. Obviously, a lot of the reason was the revolutionary special effects. The film was something that wasn't seen before on the big screens, and the making of Star Wars basically revolutionized the whole field of special effects for years to come. Industrial Light and Magic, the company that did the special effects, went on to be a titan in the field. But that's not it. It was also just a genuinely good movie, a fun adventure film with some more serious undertones. Lucas always talked about how he wanted the original trilogy to have those undertones of criticisms of imperialism, of US imperialism in the context of war in Vietnam. But anyway, even if you just look at it on the surface level, it was a really fine film. Everything worked about it. And so it's a bit surprising when you delve deeper into the background of how the film was conceived and created, because then it turns out that it was a good film against all odds. Lucas was still a young director at the time, and when he was working on Star Wars, he has proven to everyone around him that he was an excellent world builder, but he wasn't that great at writing scripts. A lot of the people complained about the dialogue sounding unnatural. Famously, Alec Guinness, who played Obi-Wan in the original trilogy, he didn't believe in the success of the films, and he considered them to be silly and childish when he was acting in them. On the other hand, Harrison Ford rewrote a lot of his lines as Han Solo because he thought they sounded unnatural. And despite those things, the original cut of the film was supposedly unwatchable. But thankfully, because Lucas was still a young person at that time, he didn't have the weight that he did in the later years. He had a lot of people around him from the studio that would go and say, "No, George, this doesn't work. You have to rework this somehow. You have to make it better." And so he had to go back to the editing room and try to make something better of the film. And here's when Marcia Lucas comes into the picture. She was his wife at the time, and as it turns out, she was one of the best skilled editors in the history of Hollywood, probably. She made Star Wars what Star Wars is. There's a lot of deleted scenes available on YouTube or other places on the internet where you can see the deleted scenes, and pretty much in every single case you can see how removing that particular scene just improved the film, because it improved the pacing. The scene didn't really bring that much new to the table, or even was bringing the whole film down in some ways. She also reworked the scene sequencing. She basically made Star Wars from a garbage, unwatchable film to what we know today. And so Star Wars was a massive hit. Then it was followed by Empire Strikes Back, one of the best sequels in history, I think the case can be made, and then quickly Return of the Jedi. Both sequels were pretty much equally well received by both critics and general audiences. And so the original trilogy was finished, but in the back of Lucas's head, he always wanted to go back and do the prequels. So over a decade passes, and then Phantom Menace is released in 1991, Episode 1. Now, the basic idea for this new trilogy was brilliant on paper. It was the fall of Anakin Skywalker. We were meant to see who he was as a Jedi, and then how he became. By the way, there's going to be spoilers for all of the films that are released so far. We were going to see how Anakin Skywalker was a Jedi and how he went from being a Jedi to becoming one of the most iconic evil guys in the antagonists in the history of cinema, Darth Vader. So on paper it was brilliant, but Lucas, he was aware of some of his shortcomings and he didn't want to direct the films. He had the outline of the story, he had the scripts, and then he went and asked, I think it was 11 different directors that he knew. Some of them included people like Robert Zemeckis, known for Back to the Future, Steven Spielberg, known for pick one, and Ron Howard. But nobody wanted to touch it really because, well, it's Star Wars, right? It's iconic. It's everybody knows this. Everybody loves this. So every single one of those directors is like, you know what, George? We think it's best if you just do it yourself. If you stick to your vision. You know what you want to do with it. You know where you want to go with it. And in order for the films to be as much in the spirit of the original trilogy, you have to be the one to do it. So Lucas went, okay, I guess I'll do it then myself then. But there were two problems this time around. The first one was, because Star Wars was at this point probably the biggest movie franchise of all time, Lucas carried a lot of weight, and so suddenly instead of studio people who would say to him, this doesn't work, you have to change this, he only had yes men who were like, yes, George, this is a brilliant idea, we should continue. The second problem was no Marcia Lucas. They were divorced already at that time. Famously, Marcia divorced George, I think it was right after Return of the Jedi, and the decided reason was that he was a workaholic. So she wasn't in the picture anymore. She wasn't there to help with the editing. And the result, well, it was that the movies, all three of them, were critically panned. Some of the problems with the films itself were dogshit dialogue, poor handling of some of the underlying themes, over-reliance on CGI. It's kind of ridiculous to watch the old trilogy and the newer trilogy now, because the newer one has aged much more because it was so reliant on computer generated effects instead of, like the previous one, puppets and costumes and models and stuff. There were also individual mistakes, things like Jar Jar Binks, which I think we can all agree is one of the worst fucking characters in history of everything. There were too many villains in the trilogy, and they were underdeveloped in the films itself. And supposedly, if you watch the cartoons or read the books or read comic books to fill in that knowledge, then they make more sense, you know who they are. But as a result, every single, apart from Palpatine, who is brilliant, you have Darth Maul in the first movie and then Count Dooku and General Grievous in the next two. And they are really underdeveloped, and you sort of get lost between all of them. None of them is certainly as iconic as Vader was, right? And that's also, by the way, that's also an interesting problem and a distinction between the old trilogy, the new one, because with the old trilogy, you also had a lot of media coming out, comic books, later on video games, stuff like that. But the way it worked then is that it was an expanded universe. So if you watched the movies and you wanted to learn more about this character, this world, this setting, this faction, you could go ahead and read the books. But even if you didn't, the movies still made sense on their own. However, with the new trilogy coming out, I think that's when the problem started with the expanded universe having too much story on its shoulders. So in order to fully understand what's going on with the Clone Army, with the Clone War, with the Trade Federation, You needed to read the books. And some people, like myself, I mean, I've read some, but not the ones directly related to films. So some people didn't read them and as a result felt a bit more confused. In any case, the prequel trilogy is finished with Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. And what still worked, that's the most important part, what was that backbone of the Skywalker story. The general idea was solid enough, and Lucas at least knew where he needed to go with it, what was the framing of the story, how he needed to connect it to where the old trilogy began, right? He knew what the conclusion was going to be, and so he had a general plan for all three films right away. And that's the end of the Star Wars movies, right? Well, obviously not really. Disney buys Lucasfilm in 2012 and gets to work on yet another trilogy. Now, at this point, you're thinking, brilliant. We have the Skywalker saga is finished. We have a lot of material to work with. You've got, I don't know if people are aware of this, but the movies span about 40, 50 years of time. Whereas you have a lot of books that take place way, way before that. And there's this whole thing called the Old Republic, which, there are stories that are taking place 10,000 years before the events of the films. So you basically have this huge timeline to pick with, to do anything with. And you've got already established stories that have proven to work through books, comic books, video games. You can pick them. Or you can do something new within that time frame, but you're not tethered, you're not tied to the Skywalkers, because that's, it's done already. So why do it? But okay, then it turns out that Disney is actually going to do movies that will follow the old trilogy, that will follow the same timeline and still focus on Skywalkers. Okay, that's still fine because, again, there were some books written about it and supposedly they were pretty cool. So you have the outline of the story ready for you. You just have to polish it, make it into a film, right? Well, not really, because Disney decided to basically ignore all the books that were existing previously. They said, okay, this is not canon. We're just going to do our own thing. So that's how they decided to approach the new trilogy. So they have J.J. Abrams come in and direct The Force Awakens, which was the first film of the new trilogy. It was pretty divisive. It was mostly riding on nostalgia, which worked for me. I was a big fan of the film, but I have to admit it was a rehash of A New Hope in so many ways. But again, what was cool was Abrams' signature thing, which is the mystery boxes. That's what people call it on the internet. So basically, he's really good at setting up mysteries that are not immediately resolved, but are designed to hook you in, to keep you going through the next films or episodes or whatever. So, the first film ends and we have loads of questions. Who are Rey's parents? Why did Kylo Ren become Kylo Ren? Why did he go to the dark side? Why did Luke decide to become a hermit and leave the Resistance? Why is he not training any Jedi? How did Luke's lightsaber end up at Maz Kanata's place? Who is Snoke? How did he came to be? Is he a Sith Lord? Is he someone else? Where was he before? How did the First Order came to power, came to such prominence after the fall of the Empire in Episode 6? Who the fuck are Knights of Ren? I mean, they sound badass, right? Who are they? Who is Captain Phasma, the one with the cool shiny armor? She just popped up for a second. All of those together promised that the rest of the trilogy would at least have something interesting to go on. And then Rian Johnson comes in to direct The Last Jedi. And the film comes out and is probably the most criticized Star Wars property of all time, especially by the fandom. It is said that nobody hates Star Wars as much as the fans. And that was certainly true in regards to Last Jedi. One of the main reasons for the criticism is what Johnson essentially did with all those mysteries that were previously set up. So again, if we go by the list, Rey's parents, I guess they're nobody, they don't matter. Kylo goes to the dark side because Luke just contemplates to kill him one night. And Luke Skywalker, think about this one for 1 second. Luke Skywalker, who went to Darth fucking Vader and said, I'm not going to fight you, I believe there's still good inside you, now is almost ready to kill a teenager. What the fuck? Who wrote this? Then you have the lightsaber thing. Fuck that. Luke just throws it over his shoulder, literally. Snoke, oh, I guess he's not important. He's just killed and nothing is ever explained. First Order, unexplained. I guess they just exist. Oh, and by the way, the previous film ended with blowing up their biggest base and killing thousands of their people. But at the beginning of The Last Jedi, they are suddenly super powerful again. They have the upper hand. Knights of Ren, no mention of those guys. Phasma, oh, she shows up again for 2 minutes and dies. What? This obviously raised some eyebrows, and many people started asking questions. Questions like, what the fuck? With, but the main one being more seriously, the main question was, how did the creative control over the series work as a whole? Because this is not a too stretched comparison, by the way, because Marvel Cinematic Universe is also under Disney now, and they have this man called Kevin Feige, who is the executive producer, the head of the studios, and he is in charge of having one solid plan for that is overarching all the movies. He's not coming in saying, okay, this line of dialogue needs to be here, this line of dialogue. He's not overseeing every single detail, but he ensures that the movies as a whole, when they are watched together, they are cohesive, they make sense, and they forward the big story. They push it forward, they move with it, and that it all makes sense and is working towards something. He makes sure that whoever comes in next to direct the next film doesn't just ruin all the things that were set up previously. So Star Wars, in theory, has someone like that, and that is a person named Kathleen Kennedy. But the problem is, she's more of a businessman than a creative person, and she doesn't really have full reins over the series. So what happened was, and this is a true fact, by the way. People have come out from the studio and confirmed that this is indeed the case. What happened was J.J. Abrams was brought in to do his own thing. Basically, they told him, "Listen, we have a new trilogy. The basic things that we want to do is new characters, but we're also doing the old ones. We're following the Skywalker saga. Just do whatever, right? Do whatever you want." So Johnson comes in, does this without any real supervision, and let me state that clearly one more time. At no point was there one cohesive plan or even an outline of the trilogy as a whole. So he was told to do something, but he wasn't told where we want to be in the second episode of the trilogy or in the third one, where we want to end. There was no overarching plan. So they just made stuff as they went along. And with Star Wars, which is, again, one of the biggest franchises in the world, this is just an unbelievable approach. But going back to The Last Jedi, so Last Jedi is beginning to go into pre-production, and Rian Johnson comes in, right? And he's basically, well, I imagine the conversation went something along the lines of, he asks, okay, where do we want to go with this? And the people at the studio just tell him, just do whatever, right? It's yours now. You can just do whatever. And he says, what? But there are this thing set up, this thing set up, this thing. There's all those things. What do you want me to do with it? And they said, just do whatever. It's your call. So what he's done is he basically burned every single one. He just went all in. He destroyed every single one of those mystery boxes. He took every single one of those mysteries set up, and he just said, "Fuck it, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter." And I can imagine that it could have worked. Okay, it could have worked if he had some interesting ideas to replace the ones that he just destroyed. But if you think about the film, The Last Jedi as one separate entity, and especially you consider where the characters are at the beginning of the film and where they are at the end of the film, there's just no excuse. It's garbage. We have the beginning of the film. First Order is chasing the rebels. End of the film, First Order is chasing the rebels. Nothing changed. Kylo Ren, at the beginning of the film, he's kind of struggling, but I guess he's still on the dark side. Film ends, Kylo Ren is still on the dark side. Rey, the beginning of the film, training to be a Jedi, training to be on the light side of the Force. There's that whole build-up between her and Kylo. At the end of the film, she's still on the light side of the Force. She's still training to be a Jedi. And by the way, you have you have this wonderful setup between them, and then there's that scene in the throne room where Kylo extends his hand and says, "Listen, Rey, fuck it, fuck the Jedi, fuck the Sith. Let's just go on our own and do our own thing together." And you think, yes, this is brilliant. They're gonna break the status quo, and then Rey says, "I'm gonna pass," and so we're back to square one with nothing changed. Then you have other characters, Finn and Poe Dameron. They go off on their own side quest, which not only doesn't make sense in terms of pure mechanics of the story, but also has no impact on the rest of the plot. They have this fantastic scene to kill off Leia, but she ends up doing her Superman in space thing and survives only for Carrie Fisher to die after the movie is released, thus creating a problem of what to do with the character in the next film. Luke, as I already mentioned, pretty much suffers a character assassination, as the way they led his story basically throws away all of his character development from episodes 4, 5, and 6. And by the way, this is something that Mark Hamill, the actor, agrees as well. He didn't say it outright, but you could see it in the interviews that he was very upset with the way they treated his character. So, again, to sum this up, at the end of the film, we are mainly in the exact same place we were at the beginning of it, but all the mysteries are now gone, and a couple of other things, like Luke, have been ruined in the process. And this is the end of the second film of the trilogy. Now, think about it in the context of Empire Strikes Back, okay? In Empire, we learn that Vader is Luke's father, rebels are betrayed by Lando, Han Solo is captured in Carbonite, Luke loses a duel and loses his hand, but he has a clear path now. Get yourself together, finish the training with Yoda, save Han, and defeat Vader. I can only imagine the people who watched Empire in cinemas were extremely pumped for the next one. They probably couldn't wait. I know I couldn't wait, but in my case, it was just the case of popping another VHS in the recorder and playing it right after. By comparison, at the end of Last Jedi, you have to ask yourself the question, where do we go from here? Where do we go now? What's going to happen? And more importantly, why should we care? Because that's the main takeaway for me. As a result of this massive mismanaging of the trilogy as a whole, we are now at the point where I should be most excited about what happens next, because it is the conclusion, and I find myself not giving a shit. And there's even that line in the trailer where you have Poe Dameron asking C-3PO, "3PO, what are you doing?" And 3PO answers, "I'm taking one last look at my friends." And someone pointed out on the internet that up until now, Poe Dameron and C-3PO have never interacted on screen together. So what are you talking about? What friends? There's no character relationships even built up. The only ones existing are the friendship between Poe and Finn, and the rivalry between Kylo and Rey. But otherwise, it's just a bunch of random plot points thrown together. And so that's the reason why I'm so defeated before the film even comes out. I'm unexcited. I'm not hyped at all. I'm very scared how bad is it going to be honest. Because I don't have a lot of faith that they can salvage this that late in the process. That they can take this state of things after 2 films and save it all and wrap it up in a satisfying way in just one. I just don't think that's possible. And maybe the film does end up being amazing, but still, I cannot help, as a fan, I cannot help but feel preemptively disappointed. I guess we'll see in a few days. I hope the Star Wars magic is somehow resurrected in the film. In the worst case scenario that it isn't, at least Disney Plus is currently releasing the series called The Mandalorian, which is the best Star Wars since Empire Strikes Back, which is some consolation.